Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about environments and how to use particle systems in order to start making environments look realistic, and also where to find some really good environment assets that come pre-installed with Blender. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a plane. And this plane is going to act as our environment plane. Now, one thing to start out with is environments in Blender are very heavy. You have a lot of different particles, a lot of different repeating assets, if you think about grass, for instance. So in order to make a scene renderable by Blender in any efficient way, you need to find ways to optimize your scene so that your computer is not rendering 10 million blades of grass, for instance. One of the most effective ways to do that is by bringing a camera in early and parking it to about where you want your composition to be. This is where a good storyboard or thumbnail comes in handy, depending on what you're doing. So if you're doing like an ad, a storyboard will help you compose each shot and know what each shot needs. So I'm going to bring a camera in, and I can obviously kind of scooch my camera here or there as we're kind of building out the composition of the scene. But for now, I'm going to keep it here. And just so I can keep my eyes on my composition, I'm going to create another window, and I'm going to just kind of park my camera right here. Cool. So now I can move around my scene and not affect the camera placement and see how it's affecting the composition. Okay, the first thing I want to do is I want to start sculpting this plane here to kind of create some realistic environment effects. And so the first thing I need to do to sculpt anything is add geometry to it, because you can see I only have one face here. And so Blender's not going to have a very fun time sculpting anything because it doesn't have anything to work with. So to start that, I'm just going to come over to my modifiers tab and add a subdivision surface. I'll bring it up to like 6, and I'm going to change this to simple. That way it won't actually deform my mesh, but it will add that geometry. Then I'll click apply. You can see if we go to edit mode, we have a pretty good amount of geometry to start with. And we can always add another subdivision surface on top if we need to, but I'm going to start here. Okay, so we have this going on. Now I'm going to come up to sculpt mode. We're just going to use a couple of brushes to get kind of what we're looking for. And what I'm going for is I want kind of a river going through my camera with some, maybe not hills, but varying heights, maybe a river bank off to the side. But we'll see what looks good too. So to start with, I'm going to look for the draw brush. And with any brush, you can see that I can change the direction that the brush pushes. So right now, it's kind of pushing upwards. But if I switch it, I can have it push down. I'm just going to draw out basic river, and I'm just going slowly so that I can kind of determine what composition I want for that river. This is looking pretty good. Cool, I like that for now. And so now I'm going to switch over to what's called the grab brush. That's this guy here, I think. Yeah, I'm just going to move some of this really flat ground up a little bit. Just going to be kind of rough and basically painting with a broad brush. Now there's another cool thing we can do here. So typically an environment like this isn't going to have such smooth terrain. So what we can do is we can add a texture to kind of randomly move some of those polygons around to make it look a little bit more like it's a piece of terrain. So to do that, I'm going to select my plane, and if I go to modifiers, I'm going to add a displace modifier. You can see it kind of does something crazy to start with. I'm going to click new here, still doing something crazy, but it should fix itself. And then I'm going to come down to texture, and then under type, I'm going to let's look for clouds right now. So you can see it hasn't gotten any less crazy. So if we kind of increase the scale to start with to something maybe around here, and then come back to our modifiers and decrease the strength, something pretty low. I'm going to go back and maybe bring the scale down a little bit. Let's bring the strength even lower. Yeah, let's keep it there for now. Now we just have a little bit extra roughness or displacement on our terrain. That's going to make this look more realistic down the road. Okay, so we have our basic terrain shape. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come up to Object and click Shade Smooth, just to get rid of some of that polygon look. And then we need to figure out how to add water to our riverbed. Now, there's a pretty easy way to do this, and it kind of goes back to that idea of finding ways to optimize your workflow. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to add another plane. I'm going to scale that plane up to about the same size as our terrain plane. I'm just going to push it down a little bit. And there you have it. We have a little bit of river going through our scene. And it does kind of show back here, looks a little bit awkward. So I'm going to just kind of draw this out so that it looks like the river continuously flows. Awesome. Okay. So now that we have our terrain figured out and we have some water in our river, I want to talk about an add-on that comes with Blender. That's called the A.N.T landscape generator. So real quick, let me just bring the passepartout up just so we can focus on our composition. So if we come to Edit, Preferences, and search for A.N.T, we have this A.N.T landscape here. I'm going to install that and then exit out of Preferences. Now if we add an object and just come to Mesh, you see landscape has been added. And so if we click on this and scale it up, pretty quickly we can add mountains into our scene without doing too much. The cool thing about this is you can modify these pieces of terrain pretty easily. So if we come back to adding a landscape, and we have this drop down tool here, we can do a bunch to get this landscape looking the way we want. So one cool thing we can look at is under operator presets, we have a bunch of kind of basic presets we can start with if we have an idea of where we want to begin. So if we start with maybe cauliflower hills, that might be interesting. We can manipulate a lot of these effects here to customize it to whatever needs we have. So for instance, we can increase the mesh size if we want the effect to stretch out further. We can change the offset of the noise pattern that's creating the effect. And you notice this looks pretty seamless, and the reason that is because it's using different noise patterns just like we did for this terrain here in order to affect this plane. So I'm gonna just kind of grab a basic mountain kind of preset, and I'll probably change the height a little bit, and I'm just gonna scale that up, push it to the back of our scene. And again, like we talked about with optimizing our scene, all we're doing here is we're using forced perspective in order to create the illusion of a much larger environment. So I'm gonna just kind of push these guys over here. Cool. Now you kind of see that our river's not meshing or flowing into this kind of forced perspective very well. So I'm gonna just kind of re-divert this river just to make it work for our scene a little bit better. So you can see we're kind of using some tricks in order to allude to the fact that this scene is much bigger, much more complex than it actually is. And so we're narrowing this river as it gets further, so it looks like perspective is extending that river towards these mountains here. And things like this you can obviously take a really long time refining. I'm just trying to go over the basics, so I'm kind of happy with where it is right here, at least for now. Okay, so we have our foreground terrain, our background terrain, and some water in our scene. The biggest thing our scene is missing now is some vegetation. And so you might be asking yourself, how the heck do I add grass to my scene? Luckily, the Blender developers have already thought of this, and it's pretty straightforward. So typically you'll add vegetation to your scene using what's called a particle system. A particle system basically randomly distributes a piece of mesh along the faces of an object in a random pattern. And so Blender has that tool set in order to imitate fur, grass, trees, rocks, and it's pretty easy to kind of get your head around, but I'll show you how to do that real quick. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we need to add a particle system to this plane here. And to do that, we'll come over to the right-hand side and come to Particles and click this plus icon, and we'll switch from emitter to hair. You can see automatically we have a bunch of hair particles shooting out of our object. So there are just a couple things we need to change in order to get this to act how we want to. The first thing is we need to add some advanced features. So we just click this box here. I'm going to click rotation because we're going to use that in a little bit. Then I'm going to scroll down to render, and we're going to change what our particle systems are rendering. So if we change render as to object, we can choose a single object to render across the scene. So right now I have this cube, and so if I select that instance object, you see this cube is going to be scattered across the faces of my terrain. Now, a question you might have is, what if I want to scatter randomly a collection of objects? That's pretty easy. So if I bring in a torus, for example, just bring that over here. If I put both these objects in their own collection and come back to our particle system, under render as, we just have to switch that to collection and then choose our collection, and then it will randomly distribute all of those objects. Now I'm going to delete this collection because I want to make it a little bit more practical for what we're doing. I have this grass collection up here, and so I'm going to render this collection. I'm going to render my grass collection. You can see it's starting to distribute all of this grass across my scene. Now under render as, we can increase the scale of whatever we're distributing to something a little bit more realistic. We can also change the scale randomness, and that's really useful because right now I have 3 kind of grass objects. That kind of increases the amount of objects I have, effectively speaking, because I'm able to randomize the scale. Now you see we do have a problem here, and it's that all of these kind of grass clumps are laying on their side. This is the reason we've chosen to turn on rotation, because it allows us to determine which direction these grass clumps automatically point towards. So you see under orientation axis, by default it's set to velocity or hair. If we switch that to global X, it looks like these are all just about where we want them. Now, just like with our scale, we're able to randomize the rotation. So if we click on randomize, we can just kind of tweak this a little bit, just so our grass isn't all pointing straight up. Okay, now you see we don't have a ton of grass in here, so if we wanted to increase the amount of grass we have, we can come up to the very top of our particle system and change the number of iterations we have. So if I brought that up to 100,000, you can see we have a lot more grass in our scene. This is something you want to be careful of, speaking of optimization, because particle systems can get really out of control really quickly. So as I'm kind of developing the scene, I'm going to bring the number down to 10,000. Something you're able to do is if you scroll down all the way to children, you have the option to interpolate your particle systems. And basically what that does is it uses the information of how you've developed your particle system, and then it just adds a little bit more density to that system. So if we click interpolation here, it's multiplying the actual number of particle iterations by 10 in our display viewport. And it doesn't bring down Blender's computational time tremendously, but it does to a reasonable extent. I'm going to turn that off for now because there is one big problem we haven't addressed. And that is, if we take a look, we have a lot of grass under our riverbed and on the banks of our river. And that's not very realistic. Typically what you'd expect to see in kind of a scene like this is pretty thick grass on these side plains area. But as soon as the meadows kind of start to dip into the river banks, you'd expect to see that grass disappear and be replaced with something like sand. So we need to figure out a way to get rid of these grass clumps in a way that will allow our scene to be a little bit more realistic. Again, luckily there's a pretty simple way to do that, and that's by using what's called weight maps or vertex groups. Okay, so weight painting is kind of a subset of vertex groups. Vertex groups, simply put, is a way for Blender to remember a collection of vertices and use that information in a variety of different ways. Right now we're going to use that information to tell Blender where to actually put our grass. So if we click our plane, I'm just going to select a group of vertices and come down to our data properties and click plus next to vertex group. and assign because we have these vertices selected. Okay, so we have a vertex group here. Now if we go back to object mode and come to our particle system, scroll all the way down to vertex group, we can have our vertex group affect any one of these settings. So I'm going to have it affect the density, and you can see based on the selection we had before, our particle system is only putting grass in that selected portion of mesh. Now this isn't very useful because grass is never really this uniform. So I'm going to delete this. I'm going to create a new vertex group, and we're going to use what's called weight painting. And so if we, with this vertex group selected, I'm going to switch over to weight paint, and we see we get this blue map on our mesh. Basically what we're doing is we're painting in where we want the grass to be. And this is kind of like the black and white masks we use in other portions of Blender, but this is a little bit more visually intuitive, where blue equals 0%, red equals 100%, and everything in between is a percentage of that range. So if to start, we come to our particle systems, and if we plug this new vertex group into our density, we can see everything disappears because blue equals 0%. But if we start to paint, you can see our grass starts to reappear. And we have that control again of where we actually want our grass to show up in our scene. So as you're painting, obviously left click is applying the vertex, is applying the weight paint. But if you hold down Control and click, you can remove parts of your weight paint. And so you see over here, I kind of overpainted. So I can just kind of Control click to ease that out. I'm just going to kind of paint exactly where I want my grass to be, kind of ease out portions of this. Cool. Now, again, typically grass isn't going to be this uniformly dense. And so I'm going to bring the strength down and Control click in certain areas just to remove some of the density uniformity that I have. And I think for now, this is about where I want it. And I think we're moving towards the right direction. I might modify this a little bit later, but I'm liking where it is now. Okay. So that's basically how you use particle systems. It's pretty simple, but it gives you a ton of control in how you actually place repeating objects in your scene. Now, we have grass, but there are other pieces of vegetation and nature that we might want to add to our scene. One of those is trees. Again, luckily Blender has a pretty cool add-on to help you generate trees. So if we come to Edit, Preferences, and then search for Sapling Tree Gen, I'm going to install that real quick. And if we add a curve and come down to Sapling Tree Gen, see, it's basically just put a tree into our scene. Just like with our landscape generator, there are a couple things we can kind of work with to increase the customization of this tree. One of those things is if we come down to Load Preset, it has a bunch of different options for trees we can use. I'll use small pine for now. Actually, let's do Japanese maple. And then we have under settings, we have tons of other options we can work with. What I'm going to show you here is under leaves. And then if we click on Show Leaves, you can see that Blender also has the ability to put leaves on our model. So let's add a bunch of these guys. Cool. And so now we have a pretty quick tree in our scene, and we can distribute this just like we distributed the grass. There is one thing we need to do to kind of prep this tree though. If we click on the actual branches, you can see that it's a curve. Blender doesn't really like to distribute curves on a particle system. And so in order to make this scatterable, we need to come up to Object, Convert, and Convert to Mesh. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this tree and my leaves, and I'm going to join them together so that it's one object. Then we should be able to just start scattering this. So again, I'll pull this to the side, click my mesh, I'll add a new particle system, change it to hair, add advanced features, go into rotation, and then I'm going to render an object and select my tree. You can see, first of all, it's all laying on its side. So under rotation, I'll switch it to global X and bring up the scale. But now we have a really, really densely populated forest. And so I will bring the number down to maybe 50, maybe 25. Okay. We're getting somewhere. Now all I'm going to do is add a weight paint that kind of allows me to control where these trees are distributed. So let's see, if we go to Vertex Groups, I'll add a new weight paint and then go back to a particle system and add it to the density, and let's start painting. I'll add maybe a pocket of trees here, maybe some here. Okay, I kind of liking this more or less. Yeah, I'll stick here for now. Now the only thing we need to fix with these trees is the scale. So if we come to scale, I'll change the randomness of the scale to make it look a little bit more realistic. And there we go. Now, again, we're scattering a single tree all along the face of this plane here. And if you were to do this for your own scenes, you'd probably want to have a collection of trees like we had with our grass in order to make the trees vary a little bit more. But for now and with the scene, I just wanted to kind of show you how to add these things. But for your own scenes, I would probably have a collection of trees that you can add that give variety to your scene. The last thing I wanted to show you guys is what's called a rock generator. And as the name might suggest, if we come over to Edit, Preferences, search for Extra Mesh Objects, I'll install that. Now if we come to our Mesh dropdown, we have Extras, and we have a rock generator. You see that kind of added in our grass collection, so I'm going to just pull that into our scene collection and re-add it. Now it gives us a rock, but just like with the A.N.T landscape generator, we can make modifications to this. So under presets, we could change it to an asteroid, for example, or river rock. I'll just keep it at default for now, but we can change the scale of it. We can change the deformations of it. We have a lot of control of how the rock actually gets rendered out or realized in Blender. So I'll just kind of put this guy off to the side here. And this is another thing you'd probably want to scatter throughout your scene, because there are tons of rocks in any river. But for now, I'll just kind of put it here, a lone little rock. Okay guys, I just wanted to go through those really basic landscape generation tools and workflows. They're pretty simple, but the biggest things are optimizing your scene so that you're not creating an entire world for your render, but you're creating individual scenes that work for whichever project you're working on. That's all I have for you guys. Thanks, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.